Hello. Thank you all for being flexible and understanding about this. Today I'm going to be going over pre-assessment, and I know since you're on your own that it'll be tempting to not look at all the samples that I'm going to send your way, but I encourage you to please take the time to do that. This is a really different kind of concept than what we usually talk about. And it's one where I think the examples are going to help solidify everything and make the most sense. Remember that it is totally cool if you want to work with classmates on this. The whole idea is to support each other and get a strong understanding of this complex topic. This is just a reminder that your how-to paper is due next week. We'll be working on that in class. So please make sure you have the written instructions submitted before you get to class and that you also come prepared with materials so that one person can follow the directions that you've written up. And also please remember that the one stipulation is that you cannot have any images in your directions. All right, thanks. As a little bit of a review, I just wanted to remind you about reliability and validity. A good assessment is both reliable and valid. We talked about how there are statistical measures for this, and any of the big standardized tests should have this kind of data available. Obviously, you can't do this for teacher created assessment, which is what you're about to make, but you can control a few things. A reliable assessment is going to have similar results no matter who gives it. That you're not going to have to worry about too much because you're going to be giving the assessment eventually. And if it's valid, it measures what it's supposed to measure. So, one thing you do need to consider when you're making your pre assessment is, are the questions clear? You want to make sure that students aren't missing things just because of how the question is worded or the answers. You're going to find that if you want to make a multiple choice test, it's surprisingly confusing to make the wrong answers for it. So, you need to keep those kind of things in mind, that even though we're doing an ELA topic, that there might be some students that you would have to read some parts of it to because you're really wanting to find out if they know about these particular skills and topics rather than the whole overall idea of reading. So those are things to keep in mind whenever you're making a pre-assessment. I have used two different types of pre-assessments with you all, and I want to make sure that you understand the purposes because they're two very different purposes, but I find them both to be really, really useful. So, one example of a pre-test that you took was when I did the lesson on APA. I gave you a short little pre-test, and you've had this before where I ask you some questions before we go over it. You answer the questions before our discussion in class, and then you go back and make sure you have the correct answers afterward. I didn't use it to make any decisions about instruction. Remember that formative assessment, which is a pre assessment, is one example of that, is that you use the data for instruction. I didn't gather the data on that. It was just something I used to get your interest. It was actually a form of differentiation. Just a way to get you interested in the topic and thinking about it and being focused. But the second example I'm going to give is more in line with the type of pre-assessment you're going to be looking at and writing, but know that the one you're going to do is much, much shorter. What we asked for these lessons is much shorter than the example I'm going to give, which was your pre-test for this course. The very first day you came to class, you all had to do a multiple choice pre-assessment in Georgia View, and in just a few minutes you're going to see the results of that. That was a pre-assessment that I could use for instruction, that I look at that and see where are the places where you as a group struggle the most, where are you really confident. For example, often I've given this test and it usually works out that people understand the different types of grouping, homogeneous and heterogeneous, before I've even ever gone over it. I used to do a whole lesson on that and there was a reading, so I cut that out. So that's using that information to make decisions about instruction. So those are two different uses. And so remember, we're focusing on this second use. So now you're going to get to look at some real data. It's the data that Georgia View gives me on your pretest. And so I want to have you look over that and answer these few questions. And I plan to give you also a worksheet version of this because that's what I'd like you to submit to get credit for doing this activity today. But there's going to be two documents in Georgia View in the module. One will say question stats and one will say question details. I would like you to look at the question stats first and then go to the question details afterward and let these questions guide you. And some things to think about as you're looking through this. This is a pre-assessment, so you have had no instruction at the point that you took this. And so if you all were to ace this as a class, that would actually be concerning because that would mean that I'm wasting your time by teaching you all this stuff because you already know it. So I think I've mentioned this before that sometimes people panic when they see a failing score on a pre-assessment, and that's actually what you want to see for a class average. Because, like I said, you don't want to waste your time covering things that don't need to be covered. I've already talked to you about my example, how looking at different averages influences my decisions about teaching. One thing I do want to make sure that I clarify is that in your class at the college level, I'm not using these scores for grouping. You are all already in heterogeneous groups that you put yourself in. You have different needs, you have different strengths and weaknesses. So I don't have a hand in how you're grouped. And so the one difference here is that you need to be thinking about as you transfer this information to an elementary example, that eventually you will be using the data from the pre-assessment to create groups. At this point, I think you don't need to remember, you don't have to have centers going on and all that kind of stuff with this lesson. But what I do want you to think about is, let's just say that before the lesson starts, you can have the students move to different pods, and where I would recommend that they're probably uh, grouped heterogeneously so that you have people who are strong in different areas to help each other and bounce ideas off each other during the lesson. But you don't have to have different activities going on. You don't have to be working with different groups. This is just to get to see that you know how to look at the numbers and how to interpret them. Welcome back. Hopefully, those samples were helpful in understanding how to look at pre-assessment results. So just a couple general things to make sure you picked up on. Um, and you will be asked on the lesson plan analysis in the template to always look for whole group strengths and weaknesses. So obviously, strengths are areas where a lot of students didn't miss it, and then weaknesses would be the opposite. If there's a question a whole lot of students miss, then that would be a group weakness. And you can use that information as you're making plans for the whole group. But remember that using data for individuals or for small groups is different. And the important thing I want to tell you is that actually the most important piece of information that I could use to do grouping was something I didn't show you because I honor your confidentiality. Because I can take this data down one more level in Georgia View. So I can get Georgia View to break down each one of you and show me which questions you missed, which ones you got right, and what your answers were for all of those. So that's what I really want to be looking at if I were to do grouping. And I want you to keep that in mind as you do grouping, small groups, where you're actually working on different things. Because a lot of times people want to do grouping based on averages. Well, these people passed it, these people didn't pass it, and that's not as effective as it could be because on every assessment on maps or any of that, the people who miss questions are going to have weaknesses in different areas and strengths in different areas. So, no matter what kind of grouping you're doing, whether it's forming a reading group or just doing grouping for a lesson, you really want to dig down to the question level and make your assignments for groups based on that, which people missed the same questions or didn't miss the same questions. So there's people there to help balance it out and help each other out. Now I'm going to have you look at a couple of actual examples that come from teacher candidates from years ago. They are both successful teachers right now, but these are just assessments I pulled to help you get some ideas about what makes an assessment stronger than another one. And if you were in class today, I would have you work as a group to make a T chart about what makes a good assessment and what are things you should avoid. But I'm going to simplify it a little bit as you look at the two samples. You should see two examples in the module in Georgia View. You should see one that's main idea example 1 and main idea example 2. For this activity, I'd like you to look at both of those and compare them, and there's a few things I want you to keep in mind. Both of these were actual pre-assessments, and I observed the lesson that went along with them. I was the site supervisor. They were both for third grade, so keep that in mind as you look at it. They were written for the same grade level. And I will go ahead and tell you that one of the students knew that her assessment wasn't as strong as it needed to be, and she sent it to me for feedback. Unfortunately, she sent it to me the night before she was going to give it, so I wasn't able to give her feedback until after she had given the assessment. So keep that in mind too. But a couple things I want you to think of in particular is an assessment. It's very important for an assessment to have really clear questions. You don't need to be confused about what is being asked or any of the answers. You also need for the answers to be clearly right or wrong. You don't want to have wrong answers that somebody could sit and argue, well, that kind of makes sense. And that's a big mistake I see people make. And no, it takes a lot of time to learn how to make a multiple choice test. In fact, I don't know that I've ever perfected it. So it's really normal to have a hard time with that. The other thing is, remember that this is written for third grade. I want you to look at like how the questions are worded, the passages that are included, which one is more appropriate for a third grade level. So take a minute and look over those two assessments, please. I believe I gave you all hard copies, samples of a pre-assessment and analysis. If you have that handy, I recommend you get that out right now. I think looking at the hard copy will be a little easier than looking at the digital copy while I'm speaking. And we're going to start with the sample pre-assessment itself, and then it also has the data box underneath it. And then we'll move on to the analysis, which is in the lesson plan. So, a few things to cover. This assessment has 5 questions. The faculty here have decided that 5 questions is what we're aiming for in a pre-assessment, that you shouldn't go over that. However, I do want you to know that when you have Dr. Ridley, she is going to teach you a more detailed way to do pre-assessment, and she will have a different expectation in her course, but typically 5 questions is what we're looking for. And so you might just want to double check with your site supervisor, but that should be fine. Um, and then for me, I'm also fine if there are not 5 questions about whatever you're doing. Don't feel like you have to make stuff up and pad it. For example, kindergarten often will only be like 2 or 3 questions to cover it, and that's fine. Don't ever feel like you have to do extra, but you might want to kind of ask questions of your future professors and site supervisors to make sure that they're on track with that same expectation. I also usually recommend to have a mix of multiple choice and free response questions. The older they get, the more free response they should have rather than multiple choice. Multiple choice are easier to grade. That's the benefit of them, but they often are a little bit um, could be confusing or just too easy. So I would have to say too that if there's only 5 questions, if they're free response, it shouldn't be too bad to grade. As I look at this example, I do think that there's one change I should make to it. And that is that the 5th question, I have the students listening to me read a passage, and then they have to tell what the central message is, but I made it multiple choice. In hindsight, I feel like it would have been a better assessment to have a free response where they had to just make it up and tell me or not just make it up, but tell me straight up the central message, either in writing or one on one, or record it in a video or something, because I think making it multiple choice would make it a little bit too easy. That would definitely be the case with older students, that you need them to be coming up with this stuff on their own. So, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that you almost always are going to have a question in ELA at the end where they're applying whatever skill they've been learning about. So, if they're learning about main idea, you will have a passage that they have to read and identify the main idea. So you want to keep that in mind for whatever you're doing. But then you also need to think about what terms do they need to know to understand the topic? And is there any skill or something, even maybe from past years, that they need to have a hold on to be able to grasp this new material? We usually recommend that your first question be on the easy side so people start off feeling successful, that it might not be directly connected to the lesson, but I mean, obviously in the same subject area, but so they feel confident. So it's not like super hard and they're already bummed out before they take the rest of the test. Look into which vocabulary and make sure it's the main vocabulary, especially as we get into the older grades. They have a lot of vocabulary. You don't have to assess on all of them, but what's the main things that you're going to be talking about in the lesson? And in my example, I have a question on making an inference, because as I was teaching central message, I would talk about the fact that you have to make inferences about the central message, because sometimes the author just doesn't come straight out and tell you what it is. So this isn't technically part of the standard, but I think it's a skill you would need. So that's why I included that. So those are some tips about the questions. And you don't necessarily have to like always have a true false or something like that, that this is not a magic formula or anything. I will include separate directions about how to make this chart in Word. It's not too hard. You are not required to do this, but I like it. I find it easier to interpret than some other things. You're going to be making up a fake data set to go with your pre-assessment. You are not actually teaching this lesson and you are not actually giving the pre-assessment. So you're going to pretend like you have 10 students. So you're going to make it up for 10 students. And you get to just randomly decide who misses which question. I do want you to try to aim to have a class average that's a failing score, because you don't want them to do too well. And you want to kind of mix it up and make it look a little bit realistic, how people will perform. On my sample, the X's are ones that they missed, and the ones that aren't are ones that they got correct. It just didn't show up because I did red and blue, but it didn't show up right on the copy. So you are going to totally make that up. And to find an average, like for example, you need to find the class average. Look at that column of correct percentages. I would add those numbers up and then divide by the number of numbers. So I would add those up and divide by 10, and that will give me the percentage of my average. So that's how, whenever you're doing an average, that's what you do. You add up the numbers and then you divide by the number of the numbers. Okay, now I'm going to have you flip over and look at the pre-assessment analysis. This section is within the lesson plan template, so you'll be completing this in the plan template. The other part is not. I usually would just create my own Word document, but then I'm going to ask you to copy and paste the pre-assessment and the data and insert it at the very end of your lesson plan in the appendix so that it's all just one document. So I don't have to be clicking back and forth between documents. So if you look at the pre-assessment analysis, I went over and above in some of these sections. Like some of these, you don't feel like you necessarily have to have these many words. In the summary of the pre-assessment results, what you need to include is the class average. That's the most important thing. The class average was 56, and then that's what I need to have. And then I added a little bit more. So for whole group weaknesses, I would look at questions that the whole group didn't do very well on, where they're struggling. And you want to list which questions they are and what the question was about. And then the second part of this on the lesson plan is how are you going to address this? What are you going to do in your lesson to make up for this? Now, one thing I will tell you is that a lot of times the weaknesses are what the lesson's actually about. So just say that this lesson's about main idea and they miss the main idea question. So the lesson's targeting that. You might not be doing something special with that. It's more likely that you're going to have to do something special to target the strengths. So the whole group's strengths would be which questions did the class as a whole do really well on? So this would be, like I gave the example before, grouping homogeneous and heterogeneous groups. That was something that you all did well on and typically every class does well on. So I don't need to spend as much time on it. So look at your scores and think of things like that. What would, need not quite as much attention? And then if applicable, how will you enrich understanding of this particular element? So if it makes sense, is there some way you can go further with this to enrich their understanding and take them a little bit further? So make sure you understand in those last two sections that you tell which question they missed, what it was about, and then what you're going to do because of that. So make sure you get those parts. For needs-based grouping, this is one of the yellow areas on your lesson plan, and that means that you're being asked to do it now, and you're going to be getting some more direction about it from Dr. Ridley in future semesters. So what I would like you to do is think about what I had you when I talked about before. You are not having to do small groups. You are not having to do centers. You're not going to have a lot of different things going on. But I want you to pretend that you got to, right before the lesson, have the students move, and you might picture our classroom to help you out, that you have these tables, you're picking who sits with whom. And it's probably the best idea to have them grouped heterogeneously by the questions that they missed and got correct. Because if you have a whole table full of kids who miss the same thing, they're probably going to get off task at some point during the lesson, if not the whole lesson. So this is one time when I would not recommend homogeneous grouping. However, if you were doing small groups that you were working with, that's when homogeneous would make more sense. So the expectation for this assignment is that you can just number your fake students 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through 10, and then set it up just like it is here. Not just tell us how you're going to group them, but what the actual groups are. This shows us that you know how to interpret the numbers. All right, you've almost made it. You're almost home free. I want to just give you some general expectations about the pre-assessment beyond this assignment. This is just for the whole School of Ed. You are required to do a pre-assessment for every single observed lesson that you teach, and you need to be thinking about it way in advance because you need to give the pre-assessment and analyze it before you turn in your lesson plan to your site supervisor. And you can check the handbook. I believe it's usually at least 72 hours before you're going to teach the lesson. So you have to really look ahead so that you can make sure you have it all ready in time. The assessment should be written by you. We're hoping you'll do more than just grab a worksheet and give that out. Now, I am comfortable with you taking things from other places and editing it, but just be real careful. Some professors are going to want you to tell everything and where you got it. I definitely would encourage you if you're having to include a passage, which you will have to in this first pre-assessment you're doing, that you look for examples on the internet rather than just starting out writing your own. What I usually do is I find one and then I kind of tweak it in my own writing, just so that you are on the right track, especially now because you might not have a really good understanding of what a fourth grade passage would look like. Like I said, 5 questions maximum is what we're looking for until you're in that course where you're asked to do more explicit pre-assessments. Definitely needs to be aligned with the lesson objective. So as you're writing your pre-assessment, you need to keep going back to that beginning with the end in mind to find out that you are assessing exactly what you said you would be having the lesson about. And when you turn it in, you need to always turn in the actual pre-assessment itself and the analysis chart, which I forgot. I'm going to show you how to do that. That actually depends on the site supervisor or professor. The chart is usually not something that is expected by most people. They're fine if you look at the examples that I showed you, they just listed how many people missed each question. That works if you're doing whole group, but if you're doing grouping based on which questions people miss, then you need to be drilling down to the questions so that list is not enough. You also want to go back and look at that same standard, because remember how we talked about the spiral curriculum, and see was there something last year that I need to make sure that they got from this similar objective, because if they don't have it last year, they're not going to be able to move on to the new thing this year. This page is just outlining and clarifying what you need to turn in for next week. You need to turn in the pre-assessment analysis section of the lesson plan completed in what you're already working on. So remember that you are just going to keep adding to that blank template one section at a time. You're going to have to create a pre-assessment and create a fake data set for 10 imaginary students. You're going to put all of this within the lesson plan template. So that means your pre-assessment and your fake data set, you'll just copy and paste and put those at the end so it's all in one document. And so that's just clarified here in that last bullet. Okay, so now it's time for you to take what we've talked about and you're going to create a pre-assessment for the lesson plan that we just started together. And to the right, you can see that I've posted the standard that we are using. Describe in depth the character, setting, or event in a story or drama, drawing on specific details in the text. Example, a character's thoughts, words, or actions. You need to be thinking about a few things. You need to make sure that you're staying aligned. You want your assessment to completely go with what this objective is saying, not veer off on some tangent, and be really careful with that. You also want to make sure your questions are clear and that your answers are clear and that what you're doing is appropriate for a fourth grade level. I've said several times, Google is your friend. How I would just start this to find a passage, because you need to have them do at least one application question. I would Google fourth grade literary passages or something like that, or good passages for fourth grade character description or something like that. If you have, I think we have at least one person in class that's in a fourth grade placement. Hopefully, their mentor teacher might be able to be a good resource. Um, that's just how you're going to find them. You're going to need to just search for them. And like I said, I feel like actually getting into a fourth grade class might be a help. So maybe if you know somebody else who's in a fourth grade class or you're near one, you could ask about that. I don't mind if once somebody finds one that's good, you all share it. That's totally fine. But I do want you to know that we have to hunt for these things. Um, think about which terms in this standard you might want to check that they know how to define so that you're not having to backtrack on that. These are all terms I will say that are things that they have been working on for a while. So it's nothing that you should have to go in detail about. What you're going to be focusing on more is the process of describing things in depth. And I think we agreed that we're only going to do a story and not a drama, which would be a play. Um, and then I also want to just kind of issue a warning. One reason that I picked this particular standard is it's one that people often oversimplify. This standard is really getting at, and a lot of standards are, making inferences. This is not wanting your students to describe characters in a really easy way, not just looking at what they look like or saying they're mean, but really taking an action or words that are theirs and then inferring what that tells you about that character. So make sure as you're writing this that you're keeping that level of rigor in mind. I would recommend also that you can definitely start with go back and look at that teacher guidance document before you do the pre-assessment. You might want to also look up some examples of pre-assessments. Now remember, you do have to use caution when you're using Google because just because it's posted doesn't mean that it's on target, but that might give you somewhere of an idea to start. All right, good luck. It's going to be a little bit tricky, and I know that I'm going to have to fill in some blanks when I come back. I know it's hard for you to do this without being with me in person, but we will get it all sewed up, I promise.